This is Dave Monk, your Prairie Monk, WAFT Champaign, 90.1 on your FM dial.
And Dave on the board.
And this is fundraising season, and we'd like you to support what we do. It takes a lot of work to put these programs together and put them up on TV and YouTube. So we hope you're listening. We've been doing some promos lately, and that helps, so people know that we exist. You can have all sorts of information up on the web, but if you don't let people know it's there, then they don't know to go get it. I think I'll start with some salvage today. There's been a big wedding next door, and I pulled out of the dumpster some of the flowers, and it just reminds me that you can recycle flowers. They often go to nursing homes or hospice places. They usually are remodeled so they just don't look like they're leftovers from an event, but they are also flowers that are enjoyed, and so I shoved these into a little disc, and there are some hydrangeas that I put in bottles up along the street, and we just hope that you might do this. Right in front of me I have baby's breath and tea tree and then some other greenery, and I just stuck them in so that there's some water for them to survive on. I also went to Habitat to deliver some things. I am pretty careful about delivering things to Habitat and other salvage organizations, because there's no point in leaving something that you know is going to go into the garbage. So you have to ask. The piece of equipment I took was a little esoteric. It was a hand wash basin that fitted under a stairwell. Some people have a house where there's a stairwell going up the second floor, and there's a little closet put in there. Sometimes it has a toilet in it and a wash basin, and in order for the wash basin to fit, you have to have a certain configuration. So I took that. I'm not sure that it will make it, because we have trouble finding the person who has that sort of need, and having someone to store the piece of equipment for perhaps months before somebody says, "Oh, that's exactly what I needed." The cost of storing is very high. While there, I talked to some of the people that were breaking down compression timber. Compression board is hard to deal with. If you have a piece of furniture that is compression board, it is very heavy, and if the screws and joining elements have broken the compression board, it's very hard to re-establish anything. And once again, we don't have repair people who are prepared to deal with small repairs. So mostly broken down compression board furniture has to be busted up and put in the dumpster and sent to the landfill. And you could avoid that in the first place by asking if this piece of furniture is good. While I was there, I saw a little toy four-wheeler. It's a sort of four-wheeler that a 5-year-old gets on and runs around. It's run by a battery. It's not got a motor in it, in the sense of a two-stroke motor. But it was also in the bin, and the reason why is that it needs a battery. And the battery is probably $30 or more, and who's going to pay for that? So even the tires on that piece of equipment could be salvaged, but somebody had brought it with and left it, but not explained that the battery was out and needed to be refreshed. The child has probably gone on to other things and didn't use it anymore, and so the piece of equipment got recycled. We eventually took the pickup truck to Camp Creek out near Seymour, and we have a problem there that there's Department of Transportation tends to mow not only their own roadside area, but way over onto our adjacent railroad bed and even onto the west side of the railroad line where we pick ceanothus, which is New Jersey tea. So we were glad to take short poles. They used to be under the Black Dog Saloon, the old railroad station. They supported a floor, and that's been reconfigured. So these are like 10-inch bottoms of telephone poles or electric poles. And we will roll them on into position. So just to remind DOT people that this is the limit for mowing. I was very pleased to see as we left that there had been another DOT sign put up in the right position, and we appreciate that. The DOT does do, Department of Transportation, does do a lot to try and preserve our prairies. I talked to Nick from the Champaign unit, and they're in charge of Route 45, and they report to me or I report to them, and there's a general understanding, and we've had to deal with Ameren putting up power poles there and construction easements, and they've done a good job of repairing, so we're in the process of sending a letter to Ameren to say thank you for not herbiciding and thank you for mowing at a height that would allow the plants to come back, and the plants are coming back, and to send those some of those photographs to Ameren so that they can work with their subcontractors and people who don't always understand what a prairie is about. David and I have been working with several areas in that Route 45 region, and we hope that there'll be some generic statement there that will allow you to look at perhaps 150 pictures of prairie in situ at this time of the year. We don't exactly know how to put these up. It might be as a slideshow, but it's very helpful for people to know what you're talking about when you say a lead plant or a compass plant or things like that, and to know that that is in context with other sites that might have received seed or transplants from nearby, or it just allows you to understand that there is prairie quite close to you that you can visit many times. There's some very formal prairies like Meadowbrook Park, which really allow you access to imagine a huge prairie. But there are also little remnants here and there. I was taking someone to the airport and had to go down past Savoy to Airport Road, which was widened some years ago, and that widening inspired us to ask if the Department of Transportation had a species list for the prairie remnant that was right at Airport Road, and the answer was no, and so the construction was halted for a while, much to the chagrin of the construction people, but the natural areas, what is now the Prairie Institution that covers the Natural History Survey, the Geological Survey, and Water Survey and others, they made a list of what was there, and the Department of Transportation decided to take about 45 tree spoons of prairie to Pisodum. It's 9 miles away. It's on what were at the time fairly new, perhaps 20-year-old rest stops where prairie had been instituted by a number of people who thought that visitors to the state should be able to encounter the local ecosystem. So we were transplanting the prairie plants into an existing prairie planting at the rest stop. The technique was to take a tree spoon, which is like a shovel, so it has 3 or 4 shovels all angled, and you put them around the side of perhaps 30 or 40 plants that would be of interest, and then they are hydraulically driven into the bed, and out comes a block of prairie. It takes equipment to do this. It takes time, and it's expensive. And someone has to be around to point a finger at a local site that is good. I'm reminded of this because as I went to the airport, I noticed the docks and things that you can see from the road still growing. That prairie was planted into an artificial prairie, so you had both native and replacement prairies together, and they were doing very well after about 20 years of growth. Then suddenly the rest stop decided it needed an increase of sewage lines, and out came the prairie, and that was the end of that. It was rumored at one stage that we had cost $40,000 to do that transfer. The cost of buying some land farmland next door was prohibitive, and so some small part of that prairie was brought back up to Lincoln Avenue and 74, and if you're astute, you can see the planting. It includes the grasses, so you can see the grasses. And so our prairie has gone from the airport road to Pisodum, 9 miles, back from Pisodum to Champaign. So it's not unusual for us to have to move prairies. You can be asked to put in a prairie on a site that looks like it might not be used for many years, but then something happens and it gets used sooner, so you have to move that prairie on. That happened with us on Route 45. We had a nice little prairie at Hillcrest Lumber. It had 30 species hidden behind 2 V-angled billboards, and so that little hill was alive with prairie, and very shortly found out that the hill was going to be decapitated to bring the hill down to the level of the road, and there would be various strip organizations there. So we took that prairie over the road to plot owned by Warden Martin, and they thought we'd have it for at least 10 years. So it was an interesting site because it was on a moraine, and we could have a trail through gravel pits, which gave an indication of where the value of the beautiful soil came from. And we had a trail that was largely prairie, but within 3 years it was sold to a developer and replaced temporarily with alfalfa. So we removed that prairie and took it largely to Lake Park. And so last week we were talking about Lake Park and its relationship to Route 45 and how it got started. And one was that it was to restore a cutoff, a river cutoff that was steep and easily erodible. And the prairie has done very well there, but some of it came from almost north towards Kirby Avenue, and it's doing well. As I went to the airport, I saw the species that are still remaining at the rather destroyed remnant at Airport Road, but it also reminded me that the airport put in prairie at one stage because it felt like people should come to the community and know what their local ecosystem was. It didn't really happen. It did happen, but then it got mown out because there was a fear that there would be geese and other creatures that would be in the prairie and be, in the long run, a hazard to jet planes, which intake sometimes birds and other creatures. So that no longer exists, but over the years we have done that sort of work, and it's not necessarily a dead loss. It's reminding people that they do have an ecosystem and it should be cared for. So this week we had a special meeting of the Urbana City Council, and I thought that was interesting. The mayor especially has been very direct in developing the boneyard in the vicinity of North Broadway and Race Street, and in the vicinity of two railroad lines that used to operate in that area going east and west. The park is now almost finished and is growing its lawns, and the boneyard moves through this site with natural meanders. I'm not sure whether the meanders are mathematically organized, but they at least will cut in at one point and drop sand at another point, so that you have this sigmoid curve of going through behind the station theater. The one railroad line has been obsoleted and removed except for the bridge, so the bridge becomes a site. Bicycles can go down there. It had rained this week, and the boneyard had run higher, so there was quite a little bit of mud and soil on the bicycle track, which is part of the game, is that you can use the territory when it's dry and when it's wet, you keep out of there. But I'd see bicycle tracks through the mud, so that it was being used. Now, the question about the rest of this is that behind, from that work through to the university, is a corridor of houses that are built on the side of the boneyard. Unfortunately, the boneyard has been moved. It used to come down about Main Street and curl around and about where Strawberry Fields and Firestone is. And many of these houses and many of the businesses are built on salvage or material that has been dumped, and the boneyard has been channelized and straightened, and in order to keep it straightened, as we know, water doesn't run in a straight line, it runs in a sigmoid curve. That's the most appropriate physical relationship. If you take a bar of steel, a very thin bar of steel, and you push on both ends, you end up with a sigmoid curve. That's what happens with a river. And you can straighten it, but if you straighten it, you have to protect the edges with something like riprap stone or concrete, or you have to put in steel pilings. So a lot of the boneyard between Urbana and the university is pylons, steel pylons driven in. So it makes it very much like a sewer. But on either edge there has been growth of trees. Sometimes there are trees that we often refer to as crud trees, but they're there. And the thought is that this corridor could be opened up with a trail and room made for commercial buildings or housing, opening onto Springfield Avenue, but with a back to a nice little alleyway, which would complement what's been going on Broadway. So I wandered around again looking at that area. The buildings are obviously having problems. There are cracks in the concrete. There are sinkholes. There are buildings that have had to be removed because they have broken down. And so I found that to be a very informative situation. Some of the owners were there to speak of their property, and it was seemingly a cooperative venture, so that buildings that were built there could be functional, and perhaps even their backside could become the front side, so that you could sit on a balcony and look out over a boneyard that wasn't just a sewer ditch. It perhaps would be opened up so that it had some traditional river characters. You'd have a line which was where the river would normally run, but you would have banks on either side where that river would move left and right on the way down, and over thousands of years that meander curve could move down. If we are with it, we can design that corridor to do that sort of thing. Not easy, so when you look at the Race Street development, you'll see a lot of sandbags, probably concrete bags, that are on the exposed areas where the river will try to meander and may not be able to. But there are little waterfalls, and that sort of thing can be interesting. The Champaign City has done the same sort of thing in a more grand manner, in a way, they've taken the boneyard and made a detention pond, which is quite considerable, and it has the same situation where you can ride your bicycle or walk on the trails when there's not a flood situation, but when the flood situation comes, the detention pond acts as intended, as a detention that allows you to walk around and enjoy the water. The geese also enjoy it, so do the birds. And some of the birds are getting to be very various. It reminds me that our little pocket prairie now has hummingbirds on it. And so we're thinking to put out some hummingbird sugar to allow that to happen. There are goldfinches and doves and cardinals, and it's amazing what happens when you create a little urban situation. We have another one that part of our pocket prairie is adjacent to a billboard, and we have to be careful to make sure that the fruiting bodies of our prairie plants, some of which are quite tall, do not operate so that they destroy the visual corridor from the street. So we have to be selective, and I have now a long snipper on the end of a pole, so I don't have to go into the prairie and destroy it, but I can operate from the road. We didn't quite get all that done, and it's been mowed a little bit, but it's been mowed high, not low, and so that we're thankful for. A similar company, the same company, on South 45 has a big billboard between the railroad line and the road, and we have right near it a rather rare sunshine rose, and I was pleased to be there just recently. I removed the hemlock and the weedy species, but it too had been decapitated when I went this week just to check it out. So we have to maintain those sort of interesting associations with people who have a different point of view. Advertising signs, advertising billboards pay more if you have the area mown. And I'm tempted to say that is, we need to perhaps work with billboard people, because in some cases the people who use the billboard may actually enjoy to have a prairie in an unmown situation. But it would take an understanding by the landscaping division of the advertising company to understand that and to present it and to allow that to be rented at a reasonable price, so that the prairie or whatever it is alongside this advertising sign could be presented as a valuable artifact to your advertising. This company actually can handle a native prairie. Alongside the billboard on 45 and the sunshine rose, there were lots of bull thistles. And some of these are native and some of them are not native. But they're out at the moment, and the pollinators are just doing fine. But there's a tendency to remove thistles. It's felt that thistles are an invasive species. They're not really. The most awkward thistle is the Canadian thistle, and it's a lower thistle, and it's long since been flowering, and the disappointing part about that is that if you mow now, you take this gazillions of little parachute type, dandelion type blow seeds that go everywhere, and they spread into other locations. I keep watching thistles because they are beautiful in their own right. There are some thistle-like plants that we have too. One of them that is hard for us is teasel, because it is a rather grand dried arrangement plant. It can be new, but it survives very well. It has little cups around the base of the leaf which allow it to store water, and it gets into wreaths that go into cemeteries. It also looks like a rattlesnake master, which is also a little on the thistle side. It's got projections and whatnot, but it is a much more rare creature, and it's not invasive like teasel. Teasel was a useful plant. I just read that it was put on a wheel. You could use it by hand. You take this rather thorny seed pod and stroke wool so you get burrs out of it, and make the wool line up so that you can then spin it. Well, the people who were innovative got smart, and they make a wheel with lots of those pods on them, and it would do a more professional job of teasing your wool. The only disadvantage was that the teasel, the real teasel, wears out. So then engineers, being smart, they invented a teasel that was a metal teasel, and it lasted much longer. But teasel then is a beautiful plant in context. So do we talk to horticulturists and others and beg them not to use it? Where do you find the balance between using this plant that's almost a noxious weed? But I've been talking to florists, and I initially mistook a rattlesnake master type thistle-looking plant for a teasel relation, and then it was not so. This plant comes from Eritrea or somewhere in Africa, probably goes to Rotterdam and then is redistributed to other countries. We have our own similar plant, which is a rattlesnake master, and it has a rather thorny leaf. If you look at the leaf, it has little projections on it and makes it look like yucca. So its second name is yuccifolia. So we have to think about those little things as you walk around. I was at the farmer's market, and I usually buy some flowers there, and the flowers were being worked over by bumblebees, and it was interesting to just stand there and watch the bumblebees working at the farmer's market. So even small pieces of habitat are helpful. There are several things I have down here to talk about. One is the Farm Progress Show, which was this week. It's a huge show, and in fact, people like ourselves should be at those shows to let people know what was the wealth behind the farm implementation. It's over now, but it's a Decatur, and it's more permanently located than it used to be. It used to be moved around the country, so yes, we have to think it's a little bit like Weft going to the Quad Day and being there.
So Dave, you're talking about the Farm Progress Show. How about let you talk about that some more?
Yes, it's mainly about machinery and how you operate your farm. The university is there, the extension people. It's a very well attended local show. So I have a few other things here that I would like to mention. There's a show at the Cinema Gallery, which is by Bradshaw and Bushman. These were two art professors. Both have passed now, so this is a retrospect. But these were both people who contributed a lot of art. When I first came here, I would chat with Glenn Bradshaw and watch him putting together designs. He would paint and put translucent paper down and make creations that looked like water was moving and waterfalls, and you could put your imagination into this. David Bushman was quite interested in food and had interpreted food. So I would encourage you to go to that program. It's the Cinema Gallery in Urbana. What else do we? Oh, styrofoam boxes. That's perhaps how I got to see the Bushman and Bradshaw program, was that there are organizations that get ice cream or perishable materials like steaks in boxes that are styrofoam. Normally, you can't recycle styrofoam. It's too light, and you can't transport it and make any money out of it. And it goes to the landfill. But these boxes can be used as storage of drinks and coolers, and they can also be used by people who moving sculpted pieces. So Carolyn Baxley, who is the manager of the Cinema Gallery, uses these to protect small pieces of sculpture, and so that's how I got to be. The Cinema Gallery was delivering some styrofoam. Also had in the van at the same time a two-stroke water blasting machine that hasn't been used for a while, and I'm really looking for someone who works with small engines and could restore that. I started to take it to the recycling, but I thought this is just too valuable to throw into the garbage dump. So there's one other thing. When we're working at this, these often disjunct things that we talk about, we often have a back and fill as to what might be a useful picture, what might be readable on YouTube. what might be more impressive was if it was magnified some, and you cut out a distractor. We like you to get the visual sides of things, so that's why we're concentrating on it a lot. I took, for instance, quite a lot of photographs of the boneyard possible extensions. One of the things we encountered last week was a coyote and a cat that was half a cat. And so David was not very pleased to put that into on the air. So we had this debate, and I would like to continue this a little bit because to me, you should know about the ecosystem. You should know. I used to, even when I was teaching in high school, I used to take my students, biology students, to the abattoirs. So nobody knows what goes on to when you eat a steak from an animal. It has to be shot or destroyed in some way. It has to be dismembered. And we have a coyote problem which is getting to be serious. You have people in Tolona who would just like to get rid of these creatures because they are invasive and they're coming into town. This week, National Public Radio had on a rather interesting program. It was a TED program. David might know. It was a program that was dealing with ecology, and it was dealing with the input of wolves into parkland, where the wolf may have taken advantage of an overpopulation of deer, but it created perhaps a waterfall of different responses. So less deer meant more vegetation, perhaps. But the program did very well to explain that putting wolves back in parkland often runs to affecting a whole bond of interaction, and this is something the same with what's happening with our landscape locally. We're talking about bumblebees, we're talking about habitat, we're talking about bumblebees at the farmer's market, but the birds and the bees have no habitat left out there, and they're coming into town and they adapt. So you will find raccoons, woodchucks, hawks, geese, possums, squirrels. I could go to a dumpster these days and out pops a squirrel, and up my arm and out it's so how do we become part of that landscape? Do we eliminate the coyotes, or do we look at the results of what they do? And so David had some comments about that, and he might like to add a word now, because we had to have this sort of debate, and this is not unusual if we're putting together a program for you people to see half a cat.
In my notes here it says, "Oh no, the cat again." All I was saying is, while it's well and good to tell people about the loss of coyote habitat and mentioning on the radio that you have pictures of less than half of a cat and entrails, that doesn't mean that we want to actually introduce them into the video of the program. So rest assured, we've found a compromise, and you won't see that in the video if you go and watch UPTV this Friday at 1 o'clock or the following Tuesday evening at 6. but we've been talking about it. So yes, it is important to remember that there is a limited pie. If we take more for us, there's less for them. And the them can be wild animals, and that can be coyotes. And they don't just fall over and die. They move to smaller and smaller areas, or they just encroach on the stuff that we thought was ours now anyway. And so they're talking about the wolves also. Sometimes we don't just push them and they move to a new area. Sometimes we reintroduce them, and it can amount to the exact same thing. More predators means fewer of the animals that they predate upon, and that means there'll be more of whatever comes next. The things that those animals were eating, the plants that the omnivores or herbivores were eating. And of course, Australia is a fantastic place. You can talk about the introduction of the rabbits. It was a great idea, I'm sure, in someone's mind that, hey, if we let these things, proliferate, we'll have lots of food running around. Oh no, there's nothing to kill them. Well, let's see, how can we take care of that? Oh no, the thing that we've just introduced to kill the rabbits is now taking over too. No one seems to ever think these things through, and sometimes they're relatively benign. House sparrows, I think, are not indigenous to North America. They came over, were brought over on boats. But we never quite seem to have thought this stuff all the way through, and we're always facing the repercussions of that.
One of the things you do is you try and quarantine the animal or the plant. We have a weed tree that could have been quarantined, but it got to be used. It was an olive tree without a lot of quarantining, and it turned out to be a tremendous weed tree. But it's interesting you mentioned Australia and rabbits. I was talking to my brother last night, and it would seem that in their town the kangaroos come in now. And so the kangaroos have lost a lot of their habitat to farms and sheep and cattle, and they get to be wandering through the streets. We have the same problem with deer here. Often it's by happenstance. They don't know exactly where they're going, and it gets to be quite a dangerous thing. But part of it is that we have too many deer. And in Australia, we had too many rabbits because the rabbits had no predators, and they could multiply and utilize the grass that was available. So at one stage you had to have your farm with a rabbit-proof fence around it. That means you had to have wire netting down under the ground at least by 9 inches. You'd have teams of people who would have a sulky, and you'd go looking for rabbits. Rabbits that have warrens, so you would perhaps have ferrets to go into you would have dogs that were able to go into burrows. You would have whippets and greyhounds that were able to run faster than the rabbit. So there was this whole industry, and it continues. Rabbits are a real challenge to the operation of farmland. How do we balance? How do you take Jack White's comment that could we convince farmers to put contour pieces of prairie into their farmland? Perhaps instead of having a grassed waterway, we could have a prairie, and that would provide for pollinators especially. Right, this morning I listened to someone I think it was in England. Pollinators have become so important. Perhaps a third of our vegetables need to be pollinated. So there are, after years and years of having apiaries out in the open where people didn't really approach them, the cluey thieves have discovered that they can put a vibrator bag of some description, perhaps a wire basket over a hive. Instead of stealing the hive, they steal the insects, and then they rent these out to people who need pollinators. So it's not just ivory that is a problem. It's not just elephants eating your cornfield or whatever. It's how do humans get along with their animal counterparts. We're animals too, and once we get too many of us, then it gets to be a problem, and you have a real problem in Europe with people migrating from other countries. Part of all of this comes back to education, and education helps people to be able to understand, and it's interesting and intriguing at the moment to see the current Pope doing a lot to encourage people to be educated and to think and to not necessarily just be obeisant to the religious cause, asking and begging his priests to encourage their population to think about what they're doing. And so that is beginning to bring people back into churches to when they feel that there's a liberality that allows people to think. That means you have to have a certain amount of education to be able to do that, and then you have to have the freedom to move and shake that idea. So I think that gets most of the notes that I had for this week. I was very pleased to have Kim with me to come out to Camp Creek and dump our logs. And that area is, I checked out the Ceanothus or the New Jersey tea, and it's about ready to pick. So if you want to pick and help us provide seed for other developments of prairie, then we would be glad to have you register. Phone number is 351-1911 or 840-1911 or monkdavid0@gmail.com. I'll repeat it again. Best number to get me is probably 840-1911, or my landline is 351-1911, and my email is monkdavid0@gmail.com. And if you could come help us on the 19th, we will have I help people at Rantoul, and we would enjoy you joining us there and helping people understand what the prairie is that they will pick seed on. So this has been Dave Monk, your Prairie Monk, WEFT Champaign 90.1 on your FM dial.